So next up is Janet Barclay, also the United States Geological Survey. Her talk is titled, Remember Where You Are, Teaching a Stream Temperature Model to Embrace Long-Term Groundwater Exchange Patterns. And we see your slides, Janet.
Great, and do you see the video?
That too, yeah.
Awesome, great. Yeah, so as Allison mentioned, I am a hydrologist with the US Geological Survey, and most of my recent work has been in simulating and observing groundwater surface water exchange patterns. I'm actually relatively very new to deep learning, and so this is sort of the first project, and in the part of the focus of this project is really bringing those long-term patterns of groundwater discharge into and using those as process guidance for stream temperature predictions. As with many projects, actually every project, there's been a number of folks who are involved with this. So these are some of the folks that have contributed code and really significantly to the work on the project, and some others who have contributed ideas and reviews and things. This work is part of the ExaSheds project, which is a US Department of Energy funded project that involves multiple of the national labs, as well as USGS and the University of Texas at Austin. Groundwater discharge is an important driver of water temperature in many ecosystems. In these images, we're looking at stream bank groundwater seep. And so in this top one, we have the stream bank up here on the top left and the river channel here on the bottom right. The water line crosses kind of right diagonally across here, and you can see some sediment being actually washed into the stream from that seep. The bottom picture is a thermal infrared video, and in this image, cool colors indicate cooler temperatures and warmer colors indicate warmer temperatures. And so here we can see the cold groundwater entering that stream and mixing with the stream water and cooling it locally. In most instances, groundwater has a moderating effect on the stream temperature, warming it in the colder winter and cooling it in the warm summer. And this creates critical habitat for temperature-sensitive species. Despite the importance of groundwater discharge to stream temperatures, many temperature models do not explicitly incorporate groundwater discharge. Lack of this explicit representation can result in a couple of problems. So at least a couple of problems. So first, emitting groundwater discharge dynamics likely results in temperature predictions that are less accurate, particularly in areas with heterogeneous groundwater discharge. And these errors might be expected to become greater for predictions under future climate conditions for some reasons that I'll discuss in a few minutes. But then second, even if the predicted temperatures are relatively accurate, resource managers are hesitant to base decisions on a model that lacks a groundwater component because they know that groundwater is an important driver of stream temperatures. Like I mentioned, emitting groundwater discharge might be particularly problematic for predictions under future climate conditions. Hare et al. Analyzed long-term temperature trends in streams and rivers across the contiguous US. The sites they used are mapped in the top of this figure, and they classified each site as being influenced by atmospheric, deep groundwater, or shallow groundwater temperature drivers. The lower part of the figure shows the proportion of sites in each group. Those are the panels, the groups are the panel columns are the different groups, with temperature trends during both annual and summer periods. And so the time period of the trends is the two rows of panels. Warming trends are shown in orange, cooling trends in blue, and stable trends are in gray. And so the center column of panels, these two here, are the shallow groundwater sites. And the right column is that these two here are the deep groundwater sites. And if we look at the height of the orange bars, they found substantially more warming trends in streams that had a shallow groundwater influence, that's the center column, than in deep water groundwater influence, that's the right-hand column. And this means that to accurately predict stream temperatures in the future, we'll need to provide information not only about the extent of groundwater influence, but also whether that groundwater is deep or shallow. So we can use the multi-year time series of temperatures to identify the primary driver of those temperature patterns. At multi-annual timescales, air temperatures and water temperatures can be approximated by sinusoidal functions. And the properties of these functions are indicative of the major processes driving the stream temperatures. In streams where the primary temperature driver is atmospheric conditions, the water temperature sinusoid will be similar to the air temperature signal in both phase and amplitude. The temperature of deep groundwater varies little throughout the year. And so when deep groundwater is the primary driver of stream temperatures, the amplitude of the water temperature signal will be substantially dampened, but the phase will not be shifted relative to the atmospheric signal. And this is because all the temperature variation is coming from that atmospheric signal, even though it isn't necessarily the primary driver in the system. Unlike deep groundwater, the temperature of shallow groundwater varies seasonally, but the amplitude is dampened and the phase is shifted relative to the atmospheric signal. This means that the shallow groundwater warms later and cools later than the air temperature. And so a reduced amplitude and a phase shift in the water temperatures relative to the air temperatures are indicative of the influence of shallow groundwater. And so we can make these determinations of atmospheric shallow groundwater or deep groundwater based on multi-year time series of observed temperatures. And so we take the observed temperatures and we fit them to a sinusoidal curve, and then we can take those coefficients to calculate the amplitude and the phase. And then the final step in terms of looking at the stream temperature drivers is to calculate the difference in the ratio of the amplitudes and the difference in phase. Here we're looking at the amplitude ratio on the y-axis plotted versus the phase shift on the x-axis, both calculated using observed temperatures for sites across the contiguous US. And these are the sites that were analyzed by Hare et al. And so on the x-axis, we have that phase shift with temperature. Sites that are plotting to the left are places where the water temperature responds quickly to changes in air temperature. And points that are plotting at the right respond more slowly. On the y-axis is that amplitude ratio with points at the top having a large amplitude relative to the air temperature, and points at the bottom are places where the stream temperature has a relatively small annual amplitude relative to the air temperature. Work at sites across the contiguous US has suggested some thresholds, 10 days and an amplitude ratio of 0.65 for categorizing sites by their primary driver. And so we can identify these sites or classify them as being atmospherically driven, shallow groundwater driven, or deep groundwater driven. And now there's a lot of spread across this data, but these can work as primary categories. And so then we can use these temperature signal properties, the amplitude ratio and the phase shift, and these resulting classifications as both sources of process guidance in our deep learning models and to evaluate those models. So our group has been developing models to predict stream temperature in the Delaware River Basin, and you've heard some of that from Sam just a minute ago, using some various process-guided deep learning methods. One of the current approaches is a recurrent graph convolutional network that's pre-trained on a process model of stream temperature. And the version I'm using here simultaneously predicts stream discharge and stream temperature. So this figure is showing the root mean squared errors on the y-axis for predictions by driver classification. So the sites are on the x-axis by those classifications. And so we have the, so on the y-axis, we have the reach level root mean squared error, and then we have the classifications from the signal analysis with atmospheric on the left in red, deep groundwater in blue in the center, and shallow groundwater on the right. And we see that the root mean squared error is higher for the deep groundwater sites relative to the atmospheric sites, and also is higher for that one shallow groundwater site. The existing models also poorly predict the observed temperature properties, both amplitude ratio and the phase shift. And so here we have the predicted values on the y-axis and the observed values on the x-axis, and none of them are really plotted along that one-to-one line. There's a lot of scatter. And so these together suggest that these existing stream temperature models may have lower accuracy at sites with greater groundwater influence and highlight the importance of explicitly incorporating groundwater discharge into our stream temperature predictions. And so that's the basic objective of this project, is to explicitly incorporate that groundwater guidance, and to do that by the development of a custom loss function that takes advantage of those annual signal properties. The study area for this work is the Delaware River Basin that you heard a little bit about from Sam. It covers 4 states in the northeastern US and is a major source of water supply for 16 million people. And as Sam mentioned, it's also habitat for some temperature sensitive species, in particular the brook trout and dwarf wedge mussels. And this is a map of the river network in the Delaware, and the thicker plotted streams in red, blue, and green are those where we have enough temperature data where we can classify them based on the primary temperature driver. So the stream temperature model that I'm working from was developed by Xiaowei Jia and is currently being maintained by Jeff Sadler. As I mentioned, it uses a recurrent graph convolution network, and it has an adjacency matrix to represent the stream network's graph structure. And this model simultaneously predicts stream temperature and stream flow. The model is being run we're using data from 1980 through 2016 as the results I'm presenting today. The model is trained in 2 phases. We have a pre-training phase and a fine-tuning phase. In the pre-training phase, the model is trained to outputs from SNTemp, which is a process-based model that simulates daily stream temperatures using outputs from the precipitation runoff modeling system. And the benefit of this is that data from SNTemp are abundant. We have a temperature for every reach every day, which provides ample information for the model to establish the coarse scale temperature patterns. And then in the fine-tuning phase, the model is further refined using the observed temperatures. In this project, we're using the temperature signal properties, the amplitude ratio and the phase difference from the observed temperatures as additional targets in the fine-tuning phase. And so at each step of the fine-tuning, the amplitude ratio and the phase shift of the current predictions are calculated and compared with the observed values using the root mean squared error. And we have hyperparameters to scale both of those contributions to the loss function. There's multiple ways to extract the temperature signal properties. When we are calculating the observed values, we started with the simplest, the linear regression that I described earlier. Initially, as we calculated it in the loss function, we were using the matrix solution of the linear regression. And that approach worked, but was computationally very intensive because of needing to take the inverse of many large matrices. And so recently we started implementing a signal processing approach, and this work has very much been driven by Simon Top, which uses a Fourier fast transform to quantify the amplitudes and the phase differences. And this approach has reduced the training times by a factor of about 10. And so what we're looking at here is the change in root mean squared error, that's the y-axis, when we implemented the groundwater loss function for those 3 groups. So we have the atmospheric sites on the left in red, the deep groundwater sites in blue in the center, and the one shallow groundwater site on the right. That dashed gray line is the 0 change. And so things that plot above that line are places where the groundwater loss function reduced the model performance, and sites that are plotting below that line are places where the groundwater loss function improved the performance. And so what we see is that adding the groundwater loss terms reduced the root mean squared error in most reaches with groundwater influence, whether that was deep or shallow. If we look at the predicted and observed amplitude ratios with and without the loss function, so on the left, we have the predicted versus observed amplitude ratio with the loss function, and on the right, we have the predicted and observed amplitude ratio without the loss function, the groundwater loss function. And looking at those, we see a slightly better fit of the amplitude ratio with the loss function, although we do see that the amplitude ratio is slightly under predicted still. These results are preliminary and the sample size is small, but they do suggest that incorporating the annual properties into the loss function may improve the stream temperature predictions in streams with groundwater influenced temperature regimes. And so some of the things we're looking at as we go forward, where you have some things that we're looking at to refine these methods. And the first one is to expand the number of sites where we have observed temperature signal properties. One of those things, as I mentioned, the current scope of data, it goes up until, in this model, it goes up until 2016. We have driver and observed temperature data up through 2020, so we'll be incorporating that into the model soon. And also many water temperature sensors are not deployed year round. They're left out from spring through late fall because of the interest is predominantly in high temperatures during the late summer. And so we're going to be looking at some different methods where we can estimate these annual properties using less than annual temperature series. And then we'll also be looking into fine-tuning those hyperparameters. There's also some really important science questions that we're thinking about. We're thinking about what can we learn both from a modeling and a process perspective about reaches where this loss function does or doesn't improve the predictions. We're also asking some questions about how can we couple this with a numerical groundwater model, and can we use that to further improve the predictions. And so in summary, we see that existing KGML stream temperature models do not explicitly incorporate groundwater discharge. We see that the predictive errors are higher at sites with groundwater temperature signals. And we also see that groundwater process information can be extracted from these annual temperature signals and that we can use it in model training to improve the temperature predictions in some of these groundwater dominated reaches. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thanks, Janet. We do have a couple of minutes. Start with a question from Charu. Are you able to include nearby groundwater data directly into the LSTM as an input feature?
So we could add that in. We've tossed around, how best to incorporate groundwater discharge information. Do we put it in this loss function that's based on those annual temperature signals? Or do we add it as additional input factors or input data? I think we would need to, so that's definitely something that we're considering. We haven't done it yet. It would probably need to be output from a groundwater flow model, which is definitely available for this area.
Thanks, and I think we can do one more. Groundwater is also important for nutrient and carbon fluxes. Can your techniques be used to inform those fluxes? So I think that would be really interesting to see. I mean, right now I'm working on modeling temperature, so I haven't tried, putting it into modeling those nutrient fluxes. But I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And I think that if we do get the groundwater discharge modeling right, then it should definitely have implications and be able to be sort of ported into models of other things that are dependent on groundwater discharge. Great. Thank you, Janet, and thank you to all of our speakers from this first half of the session.